idea that we have unreached people groups, but yet I know the unreached people groups in the United States still have the opportunity of access. They have churches and podcasts and everything else. But Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or North Korea, they're not going to be there, obviously. So how do you differentiate? What is the terminology or the proper terms that we need to understand to differentiate that in our minds?
Right. Well, you're exactly right. And I mentioned this, I think, in the book, and that is by far the greatest needs for gospel proclamation, the greatest needs for church planning, disciple making, raising up national leaders is, or out of other contexts, is outside of North America, outside the traditionally Western context. And a lot of it has to do with the issue of access. For me, it's a Romans 15 matter that needs to be factored in as well. So geography is a part of it, clearly, yeah, because there are people living in difficult to reach places in parts of Asia, parts of Africa. But it's really a Romans 15 issue. And that is, Paul says, I desire to establish a foundation, where one has not been established, to not build upon another's foundation in the work that he's doing. That is a practical manifestation of the apostolic imagination, to desire to work where there is no foundation. And so we do have to acknowledge that we need more attention, more people going, more giving to work in the traditionally non-Western countries of the world. Hands down, I'm right there. At the same time, we cannot neglect what the Lord has been doing. If you look in Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27, Luke writes, and he, talking about God, and Paul's preaching in Athens, and in his sermon, Luke writes, and he, God, created from one man every nation of mankind to dwell upon the face of the earth, having determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. In other words, God has created everyone. He is also not only sovereign over their creation, but he's sovereign over where they live and when they live. And then in verse 27, there's a very, very important so what aspect. And it goes on to say, God has done this so that they might find him, that they might grope for him, that they may come to know him. And so there's something missiologically malignant if I'm willing to make great sacrifices to get on a plane, to fly 35,000 miles above the Pacific Ocean, to reach an unreached people group, while halfway across the Pacific, someone from that unreached people group flies past me and lands in the international airport in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm not willing to walk across the street to share the gospel with him. Something is problematic there. And so I would say by far greatest needs in other parts of the world, but we cannot neglect the movement of the nations around us, especially when we have extensive stories of people coming to faith in Western context, going back home and partnering with Western churches to take the gospel to people in their social networks that are unreached, and plant churches as well.
So are you saying, and again, forgive me if I get this wrong, because I think it's a both and, not an either or, but I want you to answer this. You're saying that we reach the unreached people groups that are near us, but we're also to reach the other people on the other side of the world. But you're saying, let's focus on that. Not to the neglect of that. I'm missing this. How do you get the both and here? Or is it a both and? Are you saying, hey, we need to really rethink this? We're going on all these trips trying to reach people around the world when we can really use those assets and reallocate them here, reach those people, and let's make a more concentrated effort. And in doing so, we're going to reach the people all the way over there. Is that right?
There's, again, this is very complex, and there's not a simple answer.
Right.
A lot of the people that are unengaged, unreached, for the most part, they're not migrating to the traditionally Western countries, if they're migrating at all, outside of their small communities. So to say all we need to do is focus on reaching those living in diaspora, we're falling woefully short. And it's not I don't think it's an either or. I don't think you can say, okay, 50% kind of thing. But what I would say is we've got to get to the point where we're beginning to give more of a prioritization to the unreached. I mean, as you mentioned a moment ago, I mean, among most churches, we're not in our giving and our going. I mean, one of the numbers that's out there, I mentioned in the book, for about every 30 people, I'll use the classic terminology, every 30 missionaries that are sent, only 1 out of 30 goes to the unreached people groups.
Hmm.
When you look at our financial spending, what you just mentioned a moment ago, I mean, it's very, very little goes to supporting work among the unreached people. I would say that shows that an apostolic imagination does not exist. Because if the apostolic imagination saturated our local churches, they would be embracing a Romans 15 approach, and there would be a lot more attention giving to the sending and the going and the giving to the unreached. And so I don't have a percentage, but I would say we need to recognize that there are aspects of what we need to do is about building foundations where foundations don't exist at home and in other parts of the world.
Roughly, how many people groups are there in the world?
It depends on
Who's getting your stats?
it depends on what database you're looking at. There are three main databases that exist today, and some will say 11,000, some will say 12,000. I've seen some say 16,000. Just depends on how they divide up the groups, socio-linguistically, culturally speaking.
And out of those numbers, is there an agreed upon number of how many unreached there are?
Roughly speaking, you're looking at around 7,000 that would be considered, unreached. And then out of those 7,000, roughly, again, you're looking at about 3,000 of those 7,000 that are considered unengaged, unreached. So unengaged, unreached people groups means that there is no intentional evangelical church planting strategy seeking to engage them with the gospel and plant churches among them. So those are the numbers that are out there. They're rough numbers. They're easy to access online, though.